This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. The Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, Maryland collapsed overnight. Search and rescue operations are still underway for people who fell into the water. NTD's Luis Martinez joins us live from the scene. Luis, what can you tell us about the situation at the Baltimore Harbor as we speak?
Good evening, Tiffany. Yes, the latest information we received was a couple of hours ago, a press conference held by Governor Wes Moore alongside Senator Ben Carr, Senator Van Hollen, and also even Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. They all stress that this is still a search and rescue operation. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board is leading the investigation as to what happened, but they have deferred to the Coast Guard and other first responders for the search and rescue operations. Let's listen to what Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, had to say about the investigation.
Part of our investigation will be how was this bridge constructed? It will look at the structure itself. Should there be any sort of safety improvements? All that will be part of our investigation. We go very broad in our investigation.
So, Tiffany, what we know so far is that around 1:30 in the morning, the Singaporean flagged container ship Dolly struck one of the support beams of the Francis Scott Key Bridge here in the Baltimore Harbor, causing it to collapse. The container ship that hit the bridge, had lost propulsion minutes earlier and issued a mayday, a distress call to authorities who warned traffic not to go to the bridge, and thus saving lives. Let's listen to what Governor Wes Moore had to say about the incident.
We can confirm that the crew notified authorities of a power issue. Yes.
And that they had lost power on the ship.
Yes.
And Luis, what can you tell us about potential victims here?
Yes, Tiffany. So far, authorities have told us that at least 8 people fell into the water. 6 of them remain missing. They belonged to a construction crew that was working on potholes on the bridge. The other 2 people were rescued. One of them remains in the hospital, and the other one remains in contact with authorities but is safe. Tiffany, also, this bridge was built in 1977. 3 days ago, it had its 47th anniversary. It was 1.6 miles long and had 4 lanes, 2 in each direction. Is one of 3 arteries that cross from the Pataska River over into Baltimore City. The other 2 ways were underwater. Let's listen to what Fire Chief James Wallace had to say about the search and rescue operation so far.
We've been able to mark what they believe to be 3 passenger vehicles. They've also been able to mark a cement truck, and we believe we've marked a 5th vehicle. I don't know the nature of the vehicle, whether it's a passenger vehicle or work vehicle. This incident in and of itself really presented a potential for secondary collapse. Right, there had already been a catastrophic collapse. There's still certain elements of the bridge that are up, as well as the bridge on the bow of the boat.
So, Tiffany, this is still very much a search and rescue operation. President Biden also spoke earlier today promising federal funds, and that he would request Congress to give federal funds to the reconstruction of this very important bridge in Baltimore. Back to you, Tiffany.
Luis, thanks for that update. The Supreme Court today reviewed a case about an abortion pill called mifepristone. The FDA is fighting to allow easier access to the pill, while conservative groups of doctors are pushing to reinstate tighter restrictions. We turn now to NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards for the latest. Arlene, what was the FDA's argument for why they relaxed the rules on access to the pill?
Well, in 2016 and 2021, they relaxed their restrictions on things like gestational age, on doctor's visits, and access to mail. Now, they argue that there is no increased risk of harm as a result of those changes, and that these doctors who brought the suit shouldn't be allowed to bring this claim because they don't even prescribe the abortion pill. Now, the conservative doctors argue that there is a higher risk of harm due to the changes because they may have to perform emergency abortions even though it's against their beliefs. Now, Justice Barrett questioned the FDA's attorneys about the changes and how they may impact adverse events. Let's listen.
As I understand it, the serious adverse consequences that have to be reported or that FDA considers risks are death and transfusion, but not say, I mean, it seems to me, and I think the data bears this out, that the elimination of the in-person dispensing requirement or, the in-person visit at the outset would lead to mistakes in gestational aging, which could increase the need for a DNC or the amount of bleeding, et cetera. But that does not count, correct, as an adverse event?
So I want to be careful because there's a list of serious adverse events, and I'm not sure that I have all of them down to be able to recite them to you, although they're in the record. But I do think the premise of the question is wrong, this idea that the change to in-person dispensing would necessarily increase the risk of those events. That was not reflected in the data that FDA consulted.
And Arlene, what are some of the justices' other concerns that stand out to you?
I think there's a serious concern about whether or not these doctors should have been allowed to bring this claim. Now, as I said earlier, the FDA argued that they don't even prescribe abortion pills, nor do they perform abortions. And in particular, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wanted an explanation as to why the doctors couldn't just object to performing abortions, which is allowed under federal law. Now, the other concern for many of the justices is that if they allow these individual doctors to bring this claim, it may open up a can of worms for other individuals to now think that they can also sue the FDA out of a concern that they may one day have to take a certain drug and that it might harm them. Now, these justices asked the doctors more complicated questions than they asked the other side, and I think this is a sign that they are very skeptical about whether or not they should have brought this claim.
Arlene, thanks for that report.
Thank you.
And in Trump's hush money case, a New York judge today issued a gag order that will bar the former president from publicly commenting about potential witnesses in the upcoming criminal trial. That includes adult film actress Stormy Daniels and Trump's former attorney Michael Cohen. The order also says Trump can't make statements about attorneys, court staff, or family members of prosecutors. Trump's also blocked from making statements about any potential or actual juror. One exception to the gag order is District Attorney Alvin Bragg. The former president faces 34 charges of falsifying business records in the case. He's pleaded not guilty to all of them. The trial is slated to begin with jury selection on April 15th. Independent presidential candidate RFK Jr. today announced his 2024 running mate, Nicole Shanahan. That says his campaign is trying to get on the ballot in all 50 states. NTD's Jason Blair has more.
Just moments ago here in Oakland, California, RFK Jr. announced entrepreneur Nicole Shanahan as his running mate.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next Vice President of the United States, Nicole Shanahan.
Shannon, who has not held public office before, is the president of BioEcho Foundation and a California-based attorney. She was born in Oakland.
I will work with Bobby Kennedy to make America once again a country of peace, a country of compassion, a country that is prosperous and free. And this won't happen overnight, but I have seen miracles that the human spirit can accomplish.
I want Nicole to be a champion to the growing number of millennials and Gen Z Americans who have lost faith in their future and lost their pride in our country.
Kennedy, who changed from the Democratic Party to an independent in October, has said multiple times that his goal is to be on the ballot in all 50 states. However, in order to accomplish this in about half the states, he needs to have a running mate chosen. Kennedy is on the ballot in Utah. He has enough signatures to qualify to be on in New Hampshire, Hawaii, and Nevada. However, there's been reports that he might have to redo Nevada because he didn't have a VP chosen. Kennedy does seem to be the most promising third-party candidate for president. A Real Clear Politics poll showed Kennedy at 15% nationally in a three-candidate race with Trump and Biden. CNN polled Kennedy at 16% in Pennsylvania and 18% in Michigan in a hypothetical run against Trump, Biden, and Cornel West. An AP NORC poll done in February said 29% of Americans didn't know enough about Kennedy to form a view. Jason Blair, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Israelis are reacting to the ceasefire deal that the U.S. conspicuously didn't veto. And a top Israeli official was at the Pentagon today discussing with the U.S. Secretary of Defense. NTD's Jason Perry has the details.
On Tuesday, residents in Israel voiced their concerns over the ceasefire resolution that was recently passed at the United Nations Security Council.
I don't like it because for me, the hostages is the most important thing.
You're giving free cards to a Hamas a terrorist organization, and the world is abandoning Jews once again.
The ceasefire resolution does not require the hostages to be released. Israel's prime minister wanted the U.S. to veto it, but the U.S. did not, which allowed the resolution to pass. Therefore, Israel's prime minister canceled a delegation that was supposed to meet with officials in the U.S. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was in D.C. when the UN ceasefire resolution was passed on Monday.
We have no moral right to stop the war in Gaza until we return all the hostages home.
Then on Tuesday, he met with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon.
So President Biden has been clear. Israel has a right to defend itself like any other state. So we're working with Israel to ensure that an outrage like October 7 can never happen again. And the United States will not rest until all the hostages are home.
Austin also expressed concerns for the 1.5 million people living in Rafah, and he said they will discuss alternative ways to target Hamas elements. And Gallant added this in return.
We also face attacks from 7 different fronts, all led by Iran. While I sit here in the Pentagon, Hamas leader Haniya is meeting with Iranian leadership.
The leader of Hamas was indeed in Iran on Tuesday, and he said Israel has failed to achieve any of its military or strategic goals in the war. Since the war began, Israel has been facing attacks from terrorist groups such as Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen, all of which are backed by Iran. Jason Perry, NTD News.
The U.S. is imposing a new round of sanctions on trade facilitators of terrorist groups in the Middle East. They include those that help the Houthis in Yemen, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Quds Force in Iran. The Treasury Department says those sanctioned have facilitated commodity shipments and financial transactions for the terrorist groups. Separately, the Treasury Department also sanctioned 11 individuals and entities for supporting Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime. The sanctions come as the Houthis continue to attack commercial ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The terrorist group announced they had mounted 6 attacks with drones and missiles in the last 72 hours. The group added that they also attacked 2 U.S. destroyers in the Red Sea, as well as Israeli city of Eilat. It's not immediately clear if any of the targets were struck. Julian Assange will not be extradited to the United States, at least for now. The WikiLeaks founder secured a temporary win today. London's High Court says the U.S. must guarantee Assange would not face the death penalty. If they don't do so by April 16th, he will be eligible to appeal his extradition. American prosecutors are seeking to put Assange on trial on 18 counts. That's over his high-profile release of confidential U.S. military records and diplomatic info. A further hearing has been scheduled for May 20th, meaning his extradition has been put on hold. Bomb threats, tour buses vandalized, and U.S. citizens allegedly targeted with Chinese propaganda when entering the country, all of which appears to be an escalating campaign by the Chinese Communist Party to interfere with a New York-based performing arts company. NTD's Jack Bradley has the details.
An American performing arts company received 3 bomb threats over the past week. The incidents target Shen Yun Performing Arts, based in New York. Now, the company has long been the target of the Chinese regime because of its portrayal of what China was like before communism. The first bomb threat against Shen Yun this month targeted the company's offices in New York. An email account with a Chinese name said they'd placed a remote control bomb and threatened to detonate it. Emails from accounts with Chinese names were also sent to theaters in California and Vancouver. They also threatened to detonate bombs if they didn't cancel upcoming Shen Yun performances. Theater staff evacuated, but bomb technicians and detection canines found nothing in both instances. Also, 2 of Shen Yun's tour buses had their tires slashed 2 weeks ago in Costa Mesa, California, a recurring incident for the company. Just as in previous instances, the tires were slashed in a way so as to burst when driven on the freeway. We broke a story earlier this month at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. A U.S. Customs officer whose last name is Ho, a Chinese immigrant from Beijing and is fluent in Mandarin, allegedly targeted the performers while they were re-entering the U.S. after touring in Europe. Officer Ho allegedly told the dancers that they were illegal because of their faith, even though they are U.S. citizens or hold legal visas. Officer Ho is still currently working at the O'Hare Airport. The Midwest Falun Dafa Association, which is the presenter of Shen Yun, is calling on U.S. Customs and Border Protection to investigate the incident. They said in a statement, "We are deeply troubled by the discrimination, and never did we anticipate that a federal government official, especially a customs officer, would delve into an individual's personal beliefs. Such conduct not only violates federal government policy, but also undermines the foundational principles of our nation, freedom of belief." A Customs and Border Protection Watch commander said that they're investigating the incident. Many of Shen Yun's artists have experienced persecution firsthand by the regime in China for practicing Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa. It's a meditation practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, and it's been banned and persecuted in China since 1999. A Shen Yun vice president said that these threats are the Chinese regime's last-ditch effort to hide the truth. Members of Congress like Congressman Scott Perry and Michelle Steele have sent letters to the Customs and Border Protection demanding answers. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Joining us now to discuss the most recent series of incidents targeting Shen Yun is the Executive Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, Levi Browdy. Levi Browdy, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Levi, with these latest escalations with bomb threats and attacks on the Shen Yun buses, what is behind the Chinese regime's attacks? What about Shen Yun does the regime not like?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that. Why does the regime care about a dance company, right? So it really boils down to 2 reasons. One is what Shen Yun is doing is showcasing authentic Chinese culture, how beautiful and spiritual it was before the communists took power and tried to enforce Marxism on people. So it's really demonstrating how wonderful China is without the CCP, and obviously the CCP does not like that message. The second reason, though, is that the Shen Yun group was founded by Falun Gong practitioners, and the CCP has spent the last 25 years not only trying to stamp out Falun Gong, but on the world stage really sort of malign them and vilify them. And here you have a company that's showing how wonderful Falun Gong practitioners are artistically in terms of the message they give and the hope and the inspiring sort of nature of the show. And it undermines a quarter century of the CCP trying to malign Falun Gong. So for those 2 reasons, the CCP looks at Shen Yun and sees really almost an existential threat.
And you actually recently, with the Falun Dafa Information Center, came out with an in-depth report on the history of these attacks against Shen Yun around the world, not just here in America. Give us a sense of the scale of this and why Americans should care about it.
Sure. Well, this is a very global and very aggressive campaign. We looked at, it's been going on for more than 15 years at this point, where the CCP in over 38 countries has used its diplomatic corps, used proxies, used thugs to go after Shen Yun to get the show canceled. We've documented at least 130 cases where they've bullied governments, they've bullied theaters, all to try and get Shen Yun canceled. And I think this is important for Americans and really people from around the world, because this is, think of it as a case study. This is, Shen Yun is a canary in the coal mine for what the CCP can do to any group that it doesn't like, that it wants to silence. And so we really need to look at this as a case study for how CCP's tyranny could be unleashed upon anybody on the world stage. And that's why it's really important to pay attention to this.
And given all that you did just lay out, what needs to be done to stem this? Is it more awareness, exposing it, or how would we do that?
I think, well, the first step is obviously reports like this to understand. We got to analyze it and understand the sheer breadth of the problem. And then, as I mentioned, as a case study, I think what's very important is for policymakers around the world, media around the world, to look at this and say, okay, this is what the CCP is capable of. This is its capability. Now, if we're not careful, this capability could then target other domestic sort of government entities. It could target American companies. And so it really is something to get our minds around if we want to defend any kind of entity from the threat of the CCP on the world stage.
Levi Browdy, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Tiffany.
And in more China news, the Justice Department offering up to $10 million for information on the 7 Chinese hackers. A list of targets: White House staffers, senators, Pentagon contractors, and British lawmakers. For more details, join me tonight on China in Focus at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Shares in former President Trump's social media company Truth Social soared at the opening bell today, doubling his net worth. NTD's Virginia Gibson has more.
Truth Social shares surged nearly 60% during their first day of trading on Tuesday and stayed high before ending 16% higher than the opening price, more than doubling former President Trump's net worth.
This is about politics. This is about voting with your money because we can't wait for the election.
Former hedge fund manager Vijay Marolia says investors aren't buying because they think the company is financially successful. He says they're buying for social political reasons, like how Elon Musk bought Twitter.
This is not an average company. The company does not have a revenue stream yet. So this is something like a venture capital, something like a startup. I know a lot of people are calling it a meme coin or a meme stock, and they're not that wrong in the sense that this is about sentiment.
Truth Social has not yet made a profit and is much smaller than other social media firms. Despite this, the trading was so intense, NASDAQ had to pause it temporarily. Virginia Gibson, NTD News.
For more analysis of the value of Truth Social and its parent company is Samuel Gregg, Distinguished Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. Samuel Gregg, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Trump's Truth Social media company surged about 30% on the first day of trading. Now, is this an accurate reflection of the company's worth, or what factors do you see behind this valuation?
Well, I think there's a number of factors it's worth thinking about. One is that this reflects, of course, a merger with another company. So that means that another company has decided to invest capital in this venture, which is a signal of some confidence that an outsider, so to speak, has. This will be a going financial concern. So that's one thing. It's not a majority stake, but it's a significant minority stake, and that people who follow these things would have been paying attention to that. A second thing, of course, is that we are in an election year, and Truth Social is how Mr. Trump has been communicating to a lot of his followers and others who are not necessarily fans, his thoughts, his ideas, his commentary on political events. And so as the election year goes on, and now that he's confirmed as the Republican candidate, it's very likely that this particular form of social media will get a lot of attention, and that means advertisers and others will be interested in running things on it. The third thing to keep in mind is that so far, Truth Social has been an economic loser for Mr. Trump. He's actually lost money on this prior to this particular turn of events over the past 24 hours. So clearly, I think before people were looking at this and saying, it's not really going to go anywhere. It seems like people are pretty happy with outfits like Twitter and other forms of social media. But now that he is the Republican nominee, now that there are outside investors, significant institutional investors who are willing to invest in this, that, I think, explains the turnaround in the stock valuation very quickly. Of course, I don't think it has anything, by the way, to do with his court troubles or his need to come up with effectively a bond in the state of New York. I don't think that really has much to do with it. This is people making a calculation about how this is going to play out over the following year. Now, if he wins the election, my guess is it will go up even more because people will be saying, well, this is now the president of the United States who will be communicating with us, presumably through this rather than through Twitter. If he doesn't win, if he loses, my suspicion is that the stock price will go down pretty rapidly. So like most of these things, this particular surge in stock value reflects consumer sentiment and people thinking about how these things are going to play out over not just the short term, but the medium term and the long term as well.
Given that this is an election year and that Trump is the forerunner of the Republican Party, how do you view this political dependency, if you will, with this company?
Well, it makes it volatile, right? Because like most of these things, you're taking a risk when you invest in a company. Now, in this case, we're in an election year. That means the political risk level is much higher. Basically, if the polls are what they are at the moment in 6 months' time, which is basically showing it's going to be a very close race, then even then, if people who have invested now and they might decide to sell out just before the election, depending on what the polls are doing then, they could still make considerable money. If they don't sell out before the election and Mr. Trump loses the election, then I think they possibly stand to lose a considerable amount of money as well. So the politics is very much driving this. Another thing I should mention is that if Truth Social becomes a type of conservative alternative to a lot of other social media outfits out there, and this has been tried before, of course, and a lot of these things have failed. If it became a viable conservative alternative to the other social media outfits that are out there, then it could have some staying power. But of course, that calculus has changed since Elon Musk took over Twitter, right? And I think most people would look at Twitter and say, well, it's not the voice, so to speak, or it's not a medium by which progressive voices are effectively privileged over conservative voices. Twitter is very different now, and that was not the case when Truth Media was initially set up. So these are all very complicating factors, which I think people are going to think through very, very carefully if they're going to maintain the size of their investment in this particular stock. And they're taking a calculated risk, which is what happens when you have a stock market.
Now, when it comes to Truth Social, some of Trump's other business ventures have faced bankruptcies in the past. How do you see that fitting into investor sentiment?
Well, I think it's the case that if you look at the various, in fact, numerous ventures that Donald Trump has pursued, ranging from steak to universities, right? We do know that, like many entrepreneurial endeavors, these things fail. In fact, most entrepreneurial endeavors, regardless of whether it's Mr. Trump or someone else, most entrepreneurial endeavors fail. It's something like, I think, 9 out of 10 new businesses don't make it past 1 year. So investors will be looking at Mr. Trump's record in this regard, and they'll probably conclude, well, his successes tend to outweigh some of his losses. So if that's the calculus they're using, then they'll probably say, well, this is maybe worth investing in. But when Mr. Trump was pushing out his own university and when he was pushing his own version of stakes, he was not running for president. He is running for president now, and I think that type of calculus is going to outweigh, so to speak, some of the things that people would have looked at before when it comes to his different business ventures, precisely because he was not running for president when he was doing most of those things.
Samuel Gregg, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
And we have some breaking news. NBC News has cut ties with former Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna Mcdaniel. This comes following backlash over her joining the news network as a contributor. MSNBC personalities Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Joe Scarborough, and others have all publicly objected to NBC's hiring of Mcdaniel. It's taken almost 10 years for Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton to reach a deal in the securities fraud case against him. The plea agreement lets Paxton stay out of prison, but he'll have to pay back hundreds of thousands of dollars to investors who the court says were duped by him. This morning in Houston, Texas, special prosecutors agreed to drop 3 felony fraud charges, but Paxton still has to pay nearly $300,000 in restitution and complete 100 hours of community service. He'll also be able to retain his position as the state's chief law enforcement officer. In 2015, Paxton was accused of defrauding investors in a Dallas area tech company called Servergy. Prosecutors say he did not disclose that he was being paid by the company to recruit them. He also faced impeachment by Texas lawmakers last year. He was acquitted by the Texas Senate, but federal investigators continue to probe some of the state charges. New York City once again trying to give voting rights to non-citizens. This as ICE arrests a shocking number of wanted murderers in just one day. NTD's Ariane Pazdar has an immigration update.
So any questions?
On Monday, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, published at least 7 notices in a single day. Among those are the removal of a Salvadoran national wanted for death squad killings, the arrest of a Honduran foreign fugitive wanted for murder, the arrest of a Venezuelan citizen with ties to the Tren de Aragua gang, and the arrest of a previously removed Colombian citizen suspected of being a transnational gang member. This comes as the number of illegal crossings at the southern border is on the rise again. New numbers by Customs and Border Protection show that agents apprehended almost 190,000 illegal immigrants in February. That's not only the highest number for any February ever, but it's also up from the month before. January saw just over 176,000 apprehensions. Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn was in Texas on Tuesday, saying there are 3 things we need to secure the U.S.
One is a physical barrier. This is the much debated border wall. The second is better technology, and the third is more officers and agents.
And lastly, news out of the Big Apple. New York now reportedly started giving out prepaid debit cards to illegal immigrants this week. That's according to multiple outlets saying the first cards were given out on Monday. Families can receive up to $1,400 per month. In total, the city's contract with the bank is reportedly worth $53 million. And the New York City Council is once again trying to give voting rights to non-citizens. Back in 2021, New York City passed a law that would give 800,000 green card holders the right to vote in city elections. Now, last month, a court ruled the law unconstitutional, but the City Council keeps fighting, now taking the case to the state's highest court. There is no timeline yet for this latest appeal. Ariane Pazdar, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A New York City homeowner was arrested recently following a heated confrontation with squatters in the person's $1 million home. A number of homeowners talked about their experiences Monday, urging lawmakers to address this growing property rights issue. NTD's Daniel Monahan has the story.
Councilwoman Vicky Palladino addressed residents in Bayside, Queens, telling them the situation with squatting has gotten out of control.
You have every right to defend your property. You will do it as you need to do it.
Palladino brought up the recent case of a woman who inherited an apartment in Manhattan and returned to it from Spain.
To find 2 illegal immigrants in that apartment who beat her to a pulp, where her 19-year-old son found her stuffed in a duffel bag.
Palladino says society has reached a point where very serious decisions have to be made. According to the councilwoman, the majority of squatters prey on the weakness of New York laws.
That puts the tenants /squatters ahead of you, the property owners.
Palladino told supporters that property rights are one of the most fundamental rights that Americans have. People were gathered outside the house of a homeowner named Susan, who says her house was taken over by squatters who scammed her mom, who has since passed away.
I didn't want to sell my mother's house. I haven't even been able to go through her stuff. It's just not fair that I'm forced to sell the house. But to make matters even worse, I sold the house and they still won't leave.
This homeowner says his eviction case took 2 years and that the tenants only paid 1 month's rent the whole time. They eventually escaped when warrants for their arrest from another state became known. His lawyer told him not to change the locks, as that would be considered an illegal eviction by the courts.
A few days later, a new group of people moved into my property without my permission.
This constituent says homeowners are treated like criminals.
People buy a property thinking this is the American dream and that this is having the retirement fund. And then something like they go away on vacation, someone takes over their home, and the laws are not protecting us.
The concerned citizen is calling out lawmakers.
The laws have really done a lot of damage to our society. It makes us really question, like, what are elected officials working for?
Some in attendance called on people to contact their governmental representatives and demand action on fair laws for homeowners. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
And now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, plenty to discuss today, but let's start in the NFL, where significant changes have been made to the kickoff formations. What was the reason for this?
Well, safety for one thing, but also excitement. You know, previously, they'd really watered down the kickoff in recent years in the name of players' safety, making touchbacks and fair catches a lot more common. Essentially, though, they were limiting the kick return. I mean, it ended up being about as exciting as the extra point kick after a while. And although it was more safe, that was just because they encouraged less returns. Normally, this is a dangerous play. I mean, everyone's running full speed, making for high-speed collisions that can result in severe injuries. So these new rules will place the kicking team, except for the kicker, just a few yards away from the receiving team. It'll be on the opponent's 40-yard line for the kicking team, with the receiving team, minus the two returners, somewhere between the 30 and the 35-yard line. No one besides the kicker and returner is allowed to even move until the ball hits either the ground or a player. And in addition, no fair catches will be allowed to create much more action. So it seems like a smart change to keep kickoffs safe while making them actually entertaining again, hopefully. Anyway.
Well, now the NFL is also taking a page out of the NBA's book and scheduling a pair of Christmas games despite it falling on a Wednesday. What do you make as the reason for that?
You know, I think you hit it right on the head there, really. The NFL is really taking a page out of the NBA's book, you know, and they're wisely putting these games on Sunday. The NBA has done this largely because nobody else was. The result was very good TV ratings during football season where they normally struggle to remain relevant. Now, the NFL did 3 games last Christmas, but that was on a Monday where they normally at least have 1 game, so it wasn't that unusual. Anyway, they got massive TV ratings, so of course it was going to be there to stay. Now, I am surprised they're doing it on a Wednesday because that's a very short turnaround if you play on Sunday, but apparently if you are going to play Wednesday, that means you're going to have a Saturday game the week before to get some extra rest. But they're definitely going to be stealing viewership from the NBA with this for sure.
Now, shifting gears to baseball, Dodger star Shohei Ohtani said yesterday that he never gambled on baseball and that his interpreter had stolen millions from him and lied about it. What's been the reaction?
Yeah, a lot of shock, really. You had 2 narratives last week. One that Ohtani loaned his interpreter, who he thought was his friend, approximately $4.5 million. The other was that the money was stolen and Ohtani was the victim. Now, from one perspective, Ohtani has a very clean reputation. You would be surprised that he would run up such a huge gambling debt with an illegal bookmaker, which is against Major League Baseball rules, especially when you can just easily gamble online nowadays. He doesn't strike you as that type of gambling person. I mean, he has a very honest persona. From another perspective, though, some are shocked that a total of $4.5 million left his account. I mean, over a series of months, I guess. And Ohtani apparently had no idea. I mean, it wasn't until a federal investigation of this illegal bookmaker turned this up that this was all revealed. Of course, Ohtani makes $40 to $50 million a year. $40 to $50 million a year in endorsements, plus he has a $700 million contract with the Dodgers. So you would think that maybe they just fell through the cracks.
It's just Trump change in that case. Looking at the NCAA tournament, NCAA.com says there were more than 4 million total bracket entries across major online contests. But after just 2 rounds, only 4% for perfect entries remain. Is this unusual?
And actually, it's not really that unusual. I mean, those numbers include both the men's and women's NCAA tournament entries, and all 4 of the remaining perfect entries are for the women's bracket, where there's usually fewer upsets. I mean, there's no known perfect ones left on the men's side after just 2 rounds. That's not unusual. I mean, the women's side, there's less upsets because there are the top 4 seeds get home court advantage the first 2 rounds. The men's, for whatever reason, they do not get that. These are all played on neutral court. Neutral court fans tend to root for the underdogs. It ends up being like a road game for these favorites. Now, I would guess when Kentucky and Auburn lost in the first round, that probably eliminated nearly everyone's perfect bracket. I mean, it certainly wrecked mine. I think this kind of unpredictability, though, is what makes this event so much more popular.
Well, Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.